Is a more connected, contested and complex world, a conversation with Federica Mogherini and Kutesa, and the conversation will be led by the 8 future leaders that you see in front of you. They're going to speak first. They're going to try and lay out an analytical agenda, and when we'll get a response from our 2 dignitaries, and we'll be able to have a conversation also involving you. And the theme, a little bit underlying the discussion, is going to be the future of multilateralism in its various manifestations. Some people don't like it when I talk about the EU as a multilateral organisation, but for the sake of argument, it's about collective action. What is the future of the EU in tackling global challenges? What is the future of the UN, and how those 2 can work together? We're going to have contributions in various languages. You will need translation equipment. We have English, French, Spanish and Portuguese. They're coming up in the next hour and a half. Let me just test the mood of the audience before we start, so that we know what our starting point is. I'm going to ask you a question, and you either say yes or no, or don't know. You have 3 choices: yes, no, or don't know, or I'm asleep, or I'm not thinking, as a fourth answer. The question is, are you optimistic about the future of collective action in dealing with global problems? That means the EU and the UN and the other international bodies that we work with. If you're optimistic, you're allowed to vote on the panel if you wish, but you don't have to. If you're optimistic, put your hand up. If you're more pessimistic, put your hand up. And if you're asleep, put your hand up. Fine. Most people are not asleep. You have a lot of goodwill to start with, panel. People are generally rather optimistic about the potential for solving these problems. Let's see whether they are as optimistic at the end as they are at the beginning. I'm going to tell you who the panel are, and each of them has a topic. But what we run a risk of in this session is having what we in the UK call a balloon debate. Those of you who were at school in the UK will know that we used to have debates in which you have a balloon, and in the balloon is, for example, Karl Marx, Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. And the balloon is sinking, and one of them has to be thrown out. And then if you're debating, you have to make the case why Nelson Mandela should be kept in the balloon and say Karl Marx should be thrown out, or vice versa. Each of these future leaders is passionate about one topic, and they're going to say something about it. But we don't want to turn this into a balloon debate or a beauty contest in which you can either have migration, or you can have gender, or you can have good governance, or you can have inequality. And if you don't have any of those, then the others can stay in the balloon. We want to look for ways in which we can create global institutions which solve all the problems. So we have Shakira Chunara, who is from South Africa and whose special subject probably is health. We have Nada Diouri, who is from Morocco, who will talk a lot about international relations, although she's also an expert on gender. We have Biwa Hambo from Cameroon, who has worked a lot on migration. We have Catherine Mloza from Malawi, where are you over there, who's going to talk about food issues, among other things. We have Daniel Michalowski from Macedonia, who is going to talk about, among other things, about inequality. We have Egleson Rodriguez from Brazil, who will talk about good governance. And we have Victor Rodriguez from the Dominican Republic, who's an expert in employment and jobs. And Leah Whaler from Germany, who's an expert on energy, and particularly green energy. And of course, we're joined by 2 highly renowned international leaders. Let me introduce the guest to you first, Kutesa, who is the President of the General Assembly, but also Foreign Minister of Uganda, a very distinguished politician and diplomat in his own country and internationally, with a big part to play in working the SDGs through the system up to New York, and a key international player. And of course, Federica Mogherini, who is the High Representative, the External Affairs Chief of the EU, and with a new role under the Lisbon Treaty of pulling everything together with a strong mandate from the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, to be the integrating mechanism across the whole of the Commission on External Affairs. So all these topics we've discussed, they will be able to deal with, but we're going to try and stick to the question which underlies them about the future of collective action. And why don't we work along the panel of future leaders and hear from each of them about how they see the world, what they think the problems are, and where we should go next. So Shakira, we'll start with you, and we'll work along the panel, if that's okay. And there's a microphone on each of the white tables. And if you're going to speak in a language which is not English, perhaps say so at the beginning so people can catch up.
Can I speak in Afrikaans? I know it's very close to Dutch. Jokes aside, I'm not sure if I'm Karl Marx because I'm communist or if I'm Nelson Mandela because I'm from South Africa. But being here today, I think I'd like to raise one of two issues. One is very macro level and one is very micro level. So starting with the macro level issue is how are we going to fund the SDGs? So financing of the SDGs. And particularly touching on Africa. Africa is such a rich continent. We have amazing natural resources from coal to gold to almost anything you can imagine, including coffee. So the question is, why is it that Africa is still dependent on aid? And how is it that the SDGs will be financed? Now, I'm really tired of Africa being reliant on the EU. I feel that we should become partners. And being here at the European Commission and visiting Parliament and a couple of other institutions, there are some important lessons to take home. The first being that after the Second World War, Europe became united. And Europe has become a world power, basically. Trade has, bolstered Europe. And I feel that we have the African Union, but Africa is plagued by bad governance, so by corruption, by civil wars, by political unrest. And what I would really like is, and that's quite a big vision, is to create a United States of Africa. So I'm not a fan of Gaddafi or Mugabe, but I support this vision because in line with the EU and looking how well it functions, it's something that we as Africa could do. I'd like to see a united Africa so that we can actually tackle corruption, we can use aid efficiently, and we can really fund the SDGs. The second issue I'd like to touch on is that of persons with disabilities. Now, in post-2015, a number of SDGs will focus on persons with disabilities. I am a bit pessimistic because up until now, all persons with disabilities is a buzzword in our speeches. People basically say, we will address issues of access to persons with disabilities. But what does this actually mean in terms of healthcare? Now, I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios, and perhaps this will get you to think about it. And perhaps the EU could also let us know what are some of their policies on persons with disabilities, particularly in light of health, and how do we move forward post the SDGs. Now, imagine you're a visually impaired person or a blind person, and you do not know how to access transport. So how are you going to get to the health facility? Perhaps you do get to the health facility, but someone asks you to fill in a form. You can't see that person, you can't fill in the form, so how are you going to access the healthcare? You have to be dependent on someone. Or imagine if you are hearing impaired and you need to communicate with a medical practitioner and someone is speaking to you, but you cannot hear them. Does this person really have access to health? Or what about some health facilities in Africa, for example? We don't have ramps for people in wheelchairs, so they cannot access these facilities. So what I'm trying to highlight is that we have the policies, we have the frameworks, but persons with disabilities are the forgotten populations. We really have not focused on the implementation level. What we need is to look at what disability is, what are the experiences, and how will we really address this post-2015. It is not just related to health, but is related to other aspects. Think about job creation, which is part of one of the SDGs. How do companies want to hire persons with disabilities? They feel that it's simply too expensive to provide assistive equipment, for example. So these are just some of the issues, but I'll hand over to the others to continue.
Okay, just before you do, Shakira, You asked about financing the SDGs. You said Africa is rich. You identified a particular niche, a problem, if you like, which is access for disabled people. Who's going to finance that in Africa? Are you expecting international support? Are you going to do it yourselves? How would you feel if we ended this meeting with a big conclusion, there should be no more aid?
I think we still do need aid, because the reality is that there are a lot of contexts in Africa that are just not wealthy enough. But on the other hand, I feel that Africa needs to stop being dependent on others. We as young leaders here in Africa need to make sure that aid is used efficiently. We need to be raising our own money from our natural resources and make sure that we use this to finance the SDGs.
All right, the mic. If you're allowed to clap, you can clap. We might come back to that question of who gets aid and should it be more targeted, and should South Africa, which is in some respects a middle-income country, be a recipient of aid. But let's go next to Catherine.
Good afternoon or evening to all of you. I'm Catherine Nozabanda. I'm from Malawi. My interests largely loom over two key issues that are close to my heart and close to my continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa. The first is climate change. This is a key issue that has affected quite substantively not only the developing world but also the developed world. Now, we have had adaptation measures taken at the lowest level possible and mitigation at the highest level possible. At what point do these two meet? That's number one. Number two, the issue of carbon financing has been quite a debate about who wins, how do we actually manage to share, should I say, the blame for climate change and share the responsibility to correct what we have gone through. Largely, I'm interested to hear success stories or basically an analysis of the carbon financing concept. Has it helped, or do we need to look for something else that would perhaps bring in a scale or bring in a balance to global and local reactions to climate change? Secondly, I would like to perhaps build on what Shakira talked about on Africa being largely dependent on aid. Post 2015, I noticed the transition is more to cooperation. How do we successfully cooperate with developing countries? I for one, look at a situation where we actually invest in developing the capacity of Africa to be able to access not only markets but also to increase their bargaining power. We do indeed have natural resources. We are able to produce, but then with what we do, can we participate in a global market? Are we good enough? Are we competitive enough? To me, those are the key questions that we have to ask. And perhaps post-2015, I believe we need to delve into partnerships that are able to develop our capacity as Africa to be able to go beyond subsistence, to go beyond hand to mouth, to be able to actually be competent enough to negotiate our prices, to be on the market and be able to perform business. Thank you.
Are we good enough to compete on the international market? It sounds as though we think the answer is no.
Personally, being African, I would say we are not there. We are not yet there. We are good producers, excellent hard workers. But when it comes to being able to participate in value addition of our groundnut, of our soybean, our pigeon peas, we have a major gap.
Very good. And just on climate change, quickly, because I don't want to hold up the discussion, are you optimistic about Paris?
I am optimistic. I hope with objectivity we can be able to have good solutions that would actually be able to help not only globally but locally. Because I think at the end of the day, it's who suffers the most, who loses out in the battle against climate change. To me, to my mind, comes the smallholder farmer who depends on rain-fed agriculture. So I really foresee a situation where we actually, through the Paris meetings, have solutions that could actually be able to have impact on that average farmer.
Okay, we might come back to that as well. Thank you, Nada.
Thank you.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Je vais parler en français. Je vais vous laisser une petite minute pour vous préparer. ma part, on va commencer par faire un petit tour sur la région qui entoure mon pays. Donc, je me permets de vous emporter avec moi autour de mon pays qui n'est autre que le Maroc, vers la région MENA. On va imaginer ensemble...
Nada, sorry, 1 second. Just somebody tell us what channel English is on. I think it's 4, is that right? Your Excellency, is that okay? 4? Okay, Nada, forgive me, carry on.
Ok. So, nous allons faire un petit voyage tous ensemble vers les pays voisins de les pays qui avoisinent le mien, qui n'est autre que le Maroc. Je parle très bien de la région MENA, Middle East, North Africa. On va aller imaginer ensemble une Syrie, une Libye sans guerre civile. On va imaginer ensemble une Égypte qui arrive à réaliser ses objectifs démocratiques dont elle a tant rêvé pendant le printemps arabe. Nous allons imaginer un Yémen où il n'y a pas d'extrémisme, de radicalisme. Nous allons imaginer une Palestine où qui retrouverait ses terres, ou du moins dont la population retrouverait sa dignité. Vous voyez bien que c'est un monde imaginaire, idéal, un monde que tous nous voudrions, un monde de paix et de stabilité. Cependant, nous sommes dans un monde complexe, un monde que nous contestons tous, un monde où nous sommes interconnectés. Mais la population qui était touchée par le printemps arabe a essayé d'utiliser l'interconnexion à travers les réseaux sociaux pour sortir de l'oppression. Mais elle n'a pas réussi. J'aurais peut-être une recommandation dans ce sens. Je dirais qu'il faut, pour faire du développement, d'abord établir la stabilité dans la région, ou bien dans n'importe quelle région du monde, avoir des pays stables, et cela ne peut se faire qu'à travers des institutions régionales et internationales qui soient efficaces et fortes. Ces institutions pourront donc intervenir pour établir la stabilité et par là mettre du développement, ou bien faire le développement dans ces pays où elles voudraient donc faire évoluer l'éducation, la santé, l'égalité du genre, etc. J'espère que mon voyage n'a pas été long et que vous avez pu pour quelques secondes sortir de la réalité que nous vivons actuellement pour aller vers un idéal que nous voulons tous. Voilà, merci.
Now, when we spoke yesterday, you were expressing some disenchantment with the current performance of international institutions.
Yes.
Would you like to say something about that?
So,
In French, if you like.
Yes. Alors, pour ma part, quand je parle d'institutions fortes et efficaces régionales et internationales, je vois un conseil de sécurité qui serait réformé. Donc, je m'adresse à M. Kutesa. Je parle aussi d'une Union européenne qui aurait une possibilité d'arriver à un consensus avec ses États membres, comme par exemple Mme Mogherini a intervenu sur une vidéo lorsqu'elle s'est adressée au Parlement européen. Elle a été en voyage à Israël et en Palestine et elle avait parlé de la résolution du conflit israélo-palestinien. Vous vouliez deux États avec comme capitale commune Jérusalem. Et vous avez parlé de dialogue, vous avez parlé de consensus entre les États membres européens. Et je voulais savoir jusqu'à quel point, justement, ce consensus est difficile à avoir. C'était une volonté de votre part et vous avez appelé les parlementaires de ce jour-là pour qu'ils puissent arriver à ce point qui vous tenait en fait à cœur après ce retour du voyage. Donc ce seraient ces deux recommandations que j'aurais. On pourrait en parler encore davantage par la suite lorsqu'ils nous donneront les réponses. Voilà, merci.
Bonsoir à tous. Je suis Biru Abmo, je suis camerounais, j'étudie à l'Université de Lille 3. Je milite au sein d'une association qui œuvre pour la promotion des droits des migrants et des réfugiés. Alors j'ai quelques questions que je me pose en tant que jeune Camerounais, en tant que jeune Africain. C'est des questions sur la migration, particulièrement sur la migration clandestine. Comme l'actualité nous le rappelle, des milliers de jeunes se noient dans la Méditerranée en tentant de rejoindre l'Europe. Sans espoir dans leur pays, les études ne sont plus de garantie pour trouver un emploi. Des jeunes Camerounais, des jeunes Maliens, des jeunes Sénégalais tentent de rejoindre l'Europe à tous les prix et au péril de leur vie. Face à cette situation, qu'est-ce que l'Union européenne fait? Qu'est-ce que les autres organisations internationales font pour redonner espoir à ces jeunes qui désormais pensent que dans leur pays d'origine, leur avenir n'a plus de sens et que le seul espoir qu'ils ont, c'est de rejoindre l'Europe. Donc ça, c'est la question générale que je me pose. Et je me pose aussi une question sur comment l'Union européenne fait dans l'immédiat pour gérer la situation. Donc, dans le court terme, qu'est-ce que l'Union européenne fait pour sauver ces jeunes? Dans le long terme, qu'est-ce que l'Union européenne fait pour redonner espoir à ces jeunes Africains?
Very good, thank you very much. Okay, we're going to just, should we give him a clap? Sorry, we do clap. The world is full of problems that we've heard about: climate change, disabled people, conflict in North Africa, problems of migration, lack of capacity. There are underlying problems of collective action in the EU, certainly, also in the UN. So we're going to take a 60-second break from here to this side. If you were Mrs. Mogherini for a day, what is the one thing you would do differently? Mrs. Mogherini for a day, talk to your neighbour for 60 seconds when I say go. From this side, you are the President of the General Assembly for a day. What are you going to do differently on Monday morning that will address these underlying problems of collective action? You have just over 60 seconds starting now. And also you can talk to your neighbours.
So, we are the President of the United Nations General Assembly.
60 seconds I will leave the world as it is.
Well, I would really reform the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council, because I think it should have been reformed already years ago. And the 5 permanent members, there's no justification for having these 5 permanent members anymore, that's for sure. Furthermore, in Paris, I would really fight for a binding agreement, not only talking, but really a binding agreement for climate change, to which all countries commit, so that we can avoid having more and more negative consequences of climate change.
And in Paris and in Addis, what are you going to do?
I don't know. And you?
I'm going to ask the nations to honor their commitments.
2 from each side, if you can do it in 20 words or less. If I was Mrs. Mogherini for a day, I would. Who'd like to go first? Somebody volunteer, somebody who is passionate about something, over here. 20 words. Stand up, say who you are.
Hi, I'm a journalist from Portugal, from the national radio. I belong to the African channel. What I would do is simple. I would take off the veto right.
Okay, thank you very much. Take off the veto right. Somebody over here, anybody? Yes? Stand up, say who you are.
My name is Doris Manu. I study at the College of Europe. I would do a treaty change, have an EU army.
You'd have an EU army?
To intervene in crisis, yes.
Without a veto, if we follow that suggestion. Well, I hope I'm the general.
She wants to have a EU army?
President of the General Assembly, if I was President, I would for a day. 20 words, stand up, say who you are.
Yeah, Mohamed.Yassin UNIUD.IT. I will reform the Security Council first. Second, I will lead the Paris to frame a legally binding agreement. Third, I'm going to ask the people who will be convening in Addis next month to honor their commitments in financing the development.
Very good, thank you very much.
Good evening, I'm Rupert Simons, Chief Executive, Publish What You Fund. I would make all aid transparent, from everyone, to everyone, no exceptions.
Thank you. If the donors pay what they all promised, we could spend it on the army without a veto and publish the cost. That would be very good. One of the interesting questions about these conversations always is whether we make impossible demands of our leaders, and we're going to come to see whether you think those are reasonable demands or not in a second. Iglesias. Oh, sorry, wrong way around, sorry. I'm in a muddle, carry on.
Boa noite a todos, vou falar em português. Né? E primeiramente estou muito feliz por estar aqui representando a juventude brasileira, principalmente a juventude da periferia do Brasil, que trabalha para promover mudanças em suas comunidades. E eu acredito que é muito importante que possamos criar mecanismos de governança local que proporcione diálogo, que proporcione atuação da juventude juntamente com os governantes. Porque só assim a gente vai conseguir que as políticas públicas, que os encaminhamentos tirados junto ao governo público vai responder diretamente ao interesse das comunidades. E isso também é fundamental para que a gente tenha uma boa governança, para que a gente possa estar participando ativamente das tomadas de decisões. Então eu penso que é fundamental que a juventude, que a sociedade civil esteja participando ativamente dos processos políticos, dialogando com o governo, dizendo o que é que o governo tem que fazer para garantir os direitos das juventudes. Por exemplo, eu tenho uma experiência muito fantástica em Fortaleza que aconteceu, que quando o governo municipal estava elaborando seu orçamento público, eles retiraram 10 milhões de reais do orçamento da infância para colocar em publicidade. E a gente, quanto movimento de juventude, o movimento Jovens MJ-Pop, que é monitoramento jovem de políticas públicas, juntamente com redes, conselhos, fizeram uma mobilização virtual, reuniram-se com os governantes, realizaram audiência pública e disseram: a prioridade é a infância. Então a gente não pode remover 10 milhões de reais para colocar em publicidade. Então foi um movimento muito grande que aconteceu em Fortaleza, que pela comunidade estar envolvida, pelas pessoas estarem participando ativamente dos processos de tomada de decisão, principalmente a juventude, a gente conseguiu mudar isso e a gente teve realmente uma mudança significativa nos processos da cidade. Então eu acredito que é fundamental que a gente possa criar esses mecanismos consolidados de governança local que proporcione esse diálogo entre a sociedade civil e os governantes, porque somente assim a gente vai realmente garantir uma boa governança. E aí eu tenho duas perguntas, né, para a União Europeia, que a primeira é: quais os mecanismos que existem aqui na União Europeia que incentivam a participação da juventude nos processos de tomada de decisão? E a outra pergunta é: como eliminar os obstáculos para as juventudes em sua diversidade participar desses processos? Obrigado.
Is this problem in Brazil a problem that, is it our problem or your problem? I suppose is the question. Is it an EU problem or a UN problem that the political process in Brazil doesn't work? Is there something you would want the EU to do?
Eu acredito que esse problema ele não existe somente no Brasil. Ele existe em todas as comunidades, em todos os processos que exigem que a juventude, que exigem que a população esteja envolvida nos processos, porque a corrupção, por exemplo, ela não existe só no Brasil, ela existe também nos países desenvolvidos, e é necessário que a gente possa promover uma transparência das informações, é necessário que a gente possa promover essa oportunidade e essas capacidades para a juventude participar.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Victor.
Mi nombre es Víctor Rodríguez, tengo 23 años y soy de la República Dominicana. Soy ingeniero industrial y actualmente trabajo en el Ministerio de Industria y Comercio como encargado de proyectos para todos los temas de competitividad de pequeñas y medianas empresas. Mañana estaré participando en un panel sobre trabajo decente y tengo algunas consideraciones al respecto. Sobre todo cuando hablamos de oportunidades para la juventud, actualmente estamos, la juventud y en el mundo completo las personas actualmente están muy educadas versus otras generaciones, pero tenemos un problema de que realmente no tenemos trabajo decente, no tenemos oportunidades. Es el caso de España, por ejemplo, donde los jóvenes no tienen oportunidades. El caso de Italia, por ejemplo, tengo amigos que han tenido que ir a República Dominicana a poder trabajar porque a veces no tienen una oportunidad, personas con muy buen perfil, personas que tienen maestrías, personas que tienen mucha experiencia de campo. Entonces yo creo realmente que la educación no es solamente el pilar para trabajar el trabajo decente, sino también que debemos asegurar otras áreas como por ejemplo el incentivo de crear emprendimiento, porque el gobierno y el sector privado no pueden contratar más personas ya. Nosotros debemos incentivar a que se creen emprendimientos, por ejemplo, de alto impacto en nuestra generación y sobre todo emprendimientos tecnológicos que permitan crear más oportunidades para los jóvenes. En este panel quiero hacer énfasis en los mecanismos y acciones que pueda hacer la Unión Europea en conjunto también con América Latina para conectar ambos sectores, el sector privado de América Latina con el sector privado de Europa, con un fin principal de crear comercio y que esto produzca a su vez más oportunidades y trabajo decente en ambas generaciones. América Latina pienso que tiene toda la materia prima y Europa tiene todo el conocimiento y la tecnología. Si ambos nos coordinamos como regiones, esta será una gran acción de ganar y ganar para ambas regiones. Por mi experiencia en proyectos, trabajo actualmente en los Small Business Development Center, CARE Centro Pymes. Igualmente estoy trabajando otro proyecto, el proyecto de calidad productiva para pymes, fondeado por la Unión Europea en el periodo 2015-2019, y el enfoque es crear trabajo decente en las comunidades rurales. Entonces, para eso tengo la siguiente pregunta. ¿Cuáles serían las acciones específicas de la Unión Europea para conectar el sector privado europeo con el sector privado de América Latina y el Caribe para incentivar el desarrollo humano y económico? Muchas gracias.
I'd like to ask you lots of questions, but I'm going to hold them until later. So, Leo, you're next, please, on whatever you'd like to say.
Yes, whatever I want to say. I'm Leah, I'm from Germany, and my topic is not only energy, but also entrepreneurship, which is, I want to start with that now because we heard of it before. And my concern is that entrepreneurship isn't supported enough. Like in Germany, for example, it's a high risk, I would say. I'm from Germany, did I tell it? I don't know. Okay, it's a high risk, and because people, they are afraid to fail, and that's why they don't try. And in developing or so-called developing countries, there's often lack of knowledge. They don't know what to do or how to do things. And I just wanted to ask if the EU or general aid think that they do enough to connect, especially young people, to connect their knowledge about internal processes. For example, like youth from developing countries who know what they need, who know what they want to change in their countries, and technical solutions or even knowledge from more developed countries, so they can put a group together and work together for their own future, for the solution of, local problems. Second is energy focus. I'm actually working with clean cook stoves that are using biomass, so wood, for cooking purposes. They save a lot of energy, 65%, but every time I'm asked about energy, or I just came from an energy panel, the focus is on solar energy and electricity to establish them in, for example, Africa, where I work now. And this electricity, it takes a lot of time to install it, it takes a lot of money, you need to find investors, and you also need to invest in education and other connected fields to create a real sustainable solution for this electricity sector. And I'm wondering if there is a possibility to implement much easier, faster, and also cheaper ways of saving energy, or also making energy cleaner, and yes, also energies that are that are more faster and more likely to adapt it, I would say. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you very much. And finally, Daniel.
Yeah. I'm Daniel from Macedonia. I grew up in SS Children's Village, Macedonia. And I have campaigned for supporting the young people without parents or parental care to find a job. And I think the governments must to help all vulnerable peoples. I have a positive experience about youth without parents from my country. The government in Macedonia employ 100 people without parents or parental care. And the next about my campaign, I would like to support the private sector to employ young people without parents or parental care, because it's not solution only in government institutions. And then about income inequality, so many young people who are now graduated and goes to master studies doesn't can work or have work with secondary school. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me summarise where I think we've got to. We've heard 8 voices from 8 different countries, all of them expressing a concern for social integration and advancement and the possibilities of young people and the democratic participation that they want to have for all young people, whether they are with job, without job, and with disabilities or without. And that makes life a bit complicated. And this question that I started with, what can the UN do about all this and what can the EU do? And I want to start with you, Mr. Kutesa. You can be Mr. Kutesa for a day, or even a week, or a month, or forever. But you're also President of the General Assembly this year. I'm very curious to know whether you've heard anything that is not in the SDG framework, and the Zero draft was published this week, and where you think the limits lie of what people like this, that we respect, can expect from the UN.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and the audience. I want to first of all take this opportunity to thank these young people for their wonderful views and perspectives about what's going on in the world and going on in their own societies, and also to air them freely and courageously. So I think it's a great opportunity that we have here to have this kind of debate and discussion. You prefixed this debate by saying, should we have multilateralism or as opposed to unilateralism, I suppose. The United Nations was created 70 years ago simply because nationalism had failed. And it was important now to set up a multilateral organization that could bring people together to discuss issues. The Second World War had cost 60 million people lives. And when the United Nations was formed and its charter was written in San Francisco, it had 3 major pillars. 1, maintenance of peace and security in the world. 2nd, development, social development, cultural development, and all that, like you have under ECOSOC. 3rd, it was to have international law, respect for international law and treaties. Now, I don't think unilateralism, as opposed to multilateralism, can cause the happening of these pillars. There's no way you can maintain peace and security of the world alone. We must do it together. We cannot have world development alone. We must do it together. You cannot enforce international law and treaties alone. We must do it together. So I think, first and foremost, I believe that multilateralism was a good idea in the beginning, remains a good idea today, and must be good for the future. That's number 1. Number two, when you listen to these young men and women, their discussion can be broken into, again, three things. One, development, and I think they are mainly talking about inclusive development. Inclusive development within the world, among regions, among countries, and inside countries, within countries. I think this is what we need to address, and I think that is one of the overarching points, overarching aims of the Sustainable Development Agenda that we have. The second one, and I want to say this, that I think the greatest resource of any country is its people. You may have all the natural resources, you may have even scientific achievements and technological advances, but the biggest resource of any nation is its people. And I think investment in people, investment in the youth, skilling them, giving them security, allowing them to participate in the democratic process is the future for the world and for these people that we have. Now, talking about, for example, funding of SDGs, Shakira started by saying that Africa has a lot of resources, natural resources. Again, I want to say, well, that is true. Africa's biggest resource is its people. And now, even more so because it has a hugely young population, which we can skill, which we can retool and prepare to take on jobs as long as we have participatory democracy, as long as we have inclusive growth. Now, the financing of the SDGs, obviously, as I've said before and I repeat, aid or official development aid assistance will be necessary to finance these SDGs. And I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the European Union on committing to paying the 0.7% of their GNP as official development assistance. But let me put this point across. Even if all the European countries or all the developed countries were able to pay the money that they pledged they would pay, which is 0.7%, it would be insufficient to finance this strategic and for transformative development agenda. So we must open up and find alternative means of financing the agenda. The proposals going around are, one, to assist countries to increase their own domestic revenue collection, number one. Number two, to end and fight corruption. Number three, stop illicit transfers of loans. Number four, to try and put in place measures that mitigate against risks and bring in the private sector to participate in this development agenda. So I think that's how we should be able to finance this agenda. And I don't want to go very far, but I thought I'd leave it there for the time being.
That's great. I can't resist asking you a very undiplomatic question, and I hope you'll forgive me. But when you look at the problems that particularly were described in the MENA region, and Syria in particular, can you stand and say that the UN is at its greatest moment in history?
Let me say, it is undiplomatic, but I'll give you a straight answer too. Let me say that the United Nations and its organs were created 70 years ago under a totally different set of circumstances. And actually, if you want to be undiplomatic, it was skewed towards the victors against the vanquished, let alone those who didn't exist like Africa, who were colonies, all of us except Liberia and Ethiopia at the time when the UN was founded. When the UN was founded, it was only 51 countries. We are now 193 countries. So are we up to the task in Syria? Are we up to the task anywhere? I think we need genuine reform.
Ok, vous avez parlé là, il y a quelques secondes du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité, que c'est une des tâches du Conseil de sécurité. En fait, je lâche pas à faire. Tout à l'heure, j'ai parlé de ça, donc je reviens dessus encore une fois. Et je dois dire que cette institution, où il y a le Conseil de sécurité, sa première session s'est tenue en 1946, c'était après la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Et les choses ont changé, on est passé à la guerre froide, et puis après on a eu la multipolarité du monde. Nous sommes actuellement dans un monde multipolaire. Est-ce que vous pensez que le maintien de la paix revient seulement à 5 membres permanents, enfin à 15 membres en tout, et puis 5 membres qui détiennent le veto? Je ne pense pas. Je pense que ce qu'on pourrait proposer justement dans le Conseil de sécurité, c'est d'avoir des pays qui participent tous à la prise de décision. On devrait avoir des comités régionaux qui devraient prendre les décisions sur les questions régionales et des comités un comité international qui prendrait une décision sur les questions internationales. Et bien sûr, tout cela devrait se faire dans un vote majoritaire démocratique. Et le Conseil de sécurité actuellement ne répond pas justement à cette démocratie que nous voulons établir dans le monde. Parce que la prise de décision se fait seulement par 5 membres réellement, vu qu'ils ont le veto, et puis de manière revisitée, 15 membres en tout. Voilà.
Does the African Union fulfill that function in your view?
Absolutely not.
Because?
No. Because there is no... Il n'y a pas de consensus en fait déjà l'Union africaine, c'est ça? Parce que bon, il y a l'Union africaine, il y a l'Union du Maghreb arabe, il y a la Ligue arabe, il y a plein d'organismes régionaux. Je pense qu'ils ne font pas du tout ils ne remplissent pas leurs tâches, quoi. Ils ne font pas ce qu'ils doivent faire.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Kutesa, Security Council reform. I'm going to ask one question of the audience before I come back to you. And I'm not going to make any friends in London by asking this question. Put your hand up if you think there should be a single EU seat on the Security Council. Put your hand up if you agree. Put your hand up if you disagree. Mr. Kutesa.
Well, I think the moderator opened the floodgate by asking them diplomatic questions. And now this young lady has followed in his line. Do I think that the Security Council should be expanded? Yes, I do. Do I think that the veto should be common to all who are in it? I personally, from an intellectual jurisprudential point of view, I don't believe in a veto. Why should you veto? But if anybody is going to keep it, then whoever is there should have it. I will campaign for removal of veto. Look, what am I saying? Earlier on, someone raised the issue of Syria. That situation persists because of a veto. You know? Because someone can stand up and say, no, I support Assad, and I have the power to veto. I would not go for a veto. However, I am saying that if some people have a veto, all those who are there should have it. Otherwise, we should work towards removing. The point I'm making is this. The questions about whether the Security Council is suited for its current purposes, I'm saying there is a need for reform. And by the way, let me say that the reform is undergoing. There is an intergovernmental negotiating process, and countries have been stating their positions over and over again for the last, I think, 20 years. It's almost like a broken record. But this year, in this session, we have said let's move forward and have a text-based negotiations so that we could bring together these positions, look at the similarities, narrow down on the areas of non-convergence, and then negotiate those. So I think the process is underway, and I don't want prejudice.
Will you come back next year and tell us how you got on? Mrs. Mogherini, you've been fantastically patient, but you know a lot about unanimity, but also this issue about should there be an army, should there be a veto that came up. How do we construct collective action in Europe?
There's plenty of questions, and first of all, let me thank you for plenty of inspiring thoughts I've been listening to, and also a word of encouragement and sincere thank to all our young leaders. Let me tell you that I've been sitting in your place not that long ago, quite some time ago. I understand perfectly well how you feel, bad and good things, and also the thrill of being on stage, sharing your thoughts, and the thoughts of your communities, because what you say is the result of processes that are real, and that you bring with us here and share, and this is extremely valuable. It's not only your thinking, it's your experience, and it's the experience of your people around you. But also a little bit the sense of frustration that you might feel when you get off the stage and go back, and somehow you come back with excitement, having done a great experience, having learned a lot, shared a lot of thoughts, but also, you know, and then the next day, things don't automatically change. That is part of the complexity we're discussing about. But let me say that I really believe that the role that you can play as young leaders that are not future leaders, are leaders of today, is key. Because normally when you're young, everybody tells you, you're the future, you're the present. And without you, transforming the world that we have today, and of which we see all the limits, is not possible. Still, changing the world of today is possible, and I think that as it is possible, it's our moral duty to do it. But we cannot do it without you being leaders of today. This is just to thank you, because really, I think the energy of change is there, and this shows very well that sometimes we take the view of Europe still being at the center of the map. That is gone, long ago. This doesn't mean that there is not space for Europe in multilateralism, I'll come to that. But this means that we have to partner, many of you said that. We need to develop into a partnership. Latin America, Africa, we need to move from the donors, recipients, the Eurocentric approach, and develop a network, a web of partnerships. I think this is the right way of moving towards multilateralism that works. With strong regional organizations, with the most difficult thing to build, and Europe is the experience of that, because we built it after centuries of war, and still with a lot of tensions when we have to build consensus. I'll come to the veto question. When we were consulting, what would you do in my place, what would I do in your place, we found out that basically the challenge of our work is building consensus, building bridges, creating the possibility of taking decisions that are not a zero-sum game, but are win-win situations for all. Veto, I do not have the power of changing the treaties like that. That's, you asked what is beyond possibilities. That is beyond possibilities.
Even Mr. Cameron can't do that.
Europe also is complex and interesting. I cannot do that. I'm not even sure I would like to have the possibility of changing it like that, because I mean, if we're arguing if it's right, if some have veto power in the UN Security Council, would it be good if one single person in Brussels can change the treaties for all European citizens? I don't think it would be any way right. We have an inclusive, participatory process. Try to. But we already have some instruments in the treaties we have today that do not require unanimity, and we can use them. The example on migration we're trying to put forward is one of them. Still, you need to build a political consensus, if not among the 28, which is something I'm trying to do all the time, at least among your people, because you need to have your communities, Europeans in our case, behind the political decisions you take. Otherwise, you're not serving your people, you're not serving your communities. Building consensus, using all the instruments we have, including the ones on defense, because I was sure there was going to be a question on that. We already have, under the Lisbon Treaties, a lot of instruments for doing common defense and security. Do we use them all? No. Do I think it would be good to use them all? Yes. And my personal task, I think, is using in this 5 years of mandate, now it's 4 years and a half, I'm getting closer to the end, to use them all, which requires creating political consensus among the governments and or among the citizens of Europe. You will need to build this European feeling of being one, which is the real challenge of regional organizations. Feel one, because in the Middle East or in North Africa, you say regional organizations are not doing their task. Now, I have enough in defending the European Union. I would not do it for other organizations, even if I have to spend a word of thanks for the UN, because what they're doing, not only in Syria, but in Libya, in many other countries, conflicts in Yemen, is precious also for us. Because you said it's not UN at its best. The world we live in, it's not humanity at its best, let's say so. But would it be easy for the people of your region to unite? Can we interact like this freely?
I want to ask Catherine and Bewa to come in on a particular thing which you said, including on this.
But then I don't want to escape all the
you have other things.
great questions they have asked.
All right,
we have time, yeah.
Let me bring them in first on that. We have another half an hour. You talked about climate change, Catherine. Bewa, you talked about migration. Both of those are issues which are really contested in Europe still. And Mrs. Mogherini has talked about the need to create consensus and build the European spirit. So if we give this opportunity to you on this platform, a message to Europeans that would support Mrs. Mogherini's effort to build consensus on climate change and on migration, what would you say to Europeans that they should think differently and do differently? How do we make the case for the changes you want to see? Catherine, do you want to go first?
Yes, largely, I want to center on two things. Firstly, it's basically looking at the overall contribution of greenhouse gas emissions to the ozone layer and how it affects the globe. I think we have to get to a point to increasing, much as you'd find that the mitigation measures are expensive, we have to get to a point to investing in greener technologies that actually preserve energy and reduce the amount of greenhouse emissions. The other thing that I think I would really want to pass on is the issue of adaptation, especially at the lower levels as possible. If we could increase in building the capacity. I really love what Sam Kutesa said in investing in people. And nowadays climate change has made development complex in that it is no longer just about putting seed in the soil, but you have to look at the weather patterns, you have to look at markets, you have to look at nutrition, you have to look at if your crop has failed and you only planted one thing, what next? What do you do? So if perhaps we really cooperate to invest in climate change adaptation, we have good climate smart agriculture technologies that I believe need to be scaled up within Africa, even beyond to other developing countries that are in need of them most, to ensure that we still are collaborating together to battle climate change.
Thank you. Just hang on a second, because I want to come on energy and climate then to Leo. I mean, Germany is so famous for energy window, however you pronounce it, but your commitment to green energy. But some of your neighbours have not done that, and there are also some costs for Germany. So how do you answer Mrs. Mogherini's question, building consensus for the kind of win-win green technology that Catherine has talked about?
Actually, I didn't quite get the question.
Why do some people accept the argument for active, rapid action on climate change, and some countries don't? And how would you make the argument to support Mrs. Mogherini's political effort?
Yeah, I think it's just an economic reason, kind of. So when I look into the future, I want to have Like, I'm seeing that climate change is coming, and that when I invest in green technologies, I'm not only investing in climate, but also in my economy, because it also saves energy. But some countries may not have the most developed facilities, so they need to invest more, and they don't get that much out of it. So I think that they, kind of that. Okay.
Thank you. There are winners and losers. Burma on migration, and then we will ask Mrs. Mogherini to pick up some of the other issues. We need to make the case for Europe to be better, I think, is the question we're discussing. And you've raised migration as a big issue, and presumably you understand why people are nervous about migration. So how can we change the argument?
Je pense que aujourd'hui les Nations Unies et l'Union européenne doivent prendre les responsabilités et faire à ce qu'on s'avance davantage vers un monde où la migration serait un droit pour tous. Le droit d'émigrer fait partie des droits fondamentaux. C'est inscrit dans la Déclaration des droits de l'homme. Mais sur le terrain, la réalité est tout autre. Pourquoi cette contradiction? Pourquoi ces paradoxes? Donc, moi je suggère que les Nations Unies et l'Union européenne fassent à ce que dans les prochaines années, faire de la migration un droit pour tous doit être l'un des objectifs du millénaire. Je voudrais aussi suggérer que l'aide publique au développement destinée aux pays subsahariens soit davantage investie dans la jeunesse, que plus de 70% ou 80% de cette aide doit être réservée aux projets des jeunes. Donc, telles sont entre autres mes suggestions.
Okay, thank you very much. Mrs. Mogherini, would you like to pick up some other points?
Yes. First, also on these points, if I can, on climate change, I think the real point here is understanding and passing the message, because, as I said, we have to respond to our own public opinions, but we also have a leadership role towards our public opinion, trying to lead the way in this interconnected world. To pass the message that working on climate change is an investment in our own safety and security, linked to migration or poverty or wars, as well as many other things. You said in the beginning, the balloon story. You know, the point here that seems to me is that we are in a situation where the world is such in bad condition and everything is so much interlinked that solving one aspect or one problem is not actually diverting our attention from the others, but is helping us solving also the others. Because if you manage to do some steps on climate change, at the same time you have some steps on managing natural disasters and managing people fleeing and managing poverty and economy and creation of good jobs and so on and so forth, and better conditions for communities. So we have to move in a different paradigm. Not the balloon where you have to choose where you work, but to understand that if you don't work effectively on one thing, on one element of the puzzle, all the rest of the picture is not going to fit. On migration in particular, I think the real point, this is going to be the real point for Europe in the coming months and years, taking responsibility. Then it is also something that if we manage to do, taking responsibilities on different things. What we say, working on the root causes, which is basically working on poverty eradication, conflicts, wars, human rights, democracy, transparency, regional organizations, a lot of things together, economy, industrialization, everything. On this, but also on other aspects. The work on protection of refugees and asylum seekers, because we are seeing a shift from the purely economic migration to more and more people that are looking for asylum, because the causes of movements of people have changed over the last century, to remember that it was us Europeans, being Italian, I cannot avoid remembering it, leaving from Europe and going to Latin America, going to the United States, going everywhere in the world. It was us, the poor ones, and even inside Europe. Here in Belgium, there was plenty of Italians that moved in the 50s in difficult conditions. So keeping the memory of our responsibilities, also historical ones, and taking responsibilities today to contribute to our own interest, which is a more stable world. Taking all these responsibilities in partnership, this is the shift we should try to make. Working with the countries of origin, of transit, of temporary destination, because the majority of countries of transit become also countries of destination, working with them on different aspects, and with the United Nations system. Working with the UNHCR is crucial in this respect, to keep our own values. But then there is an additional point, and here comes again the unanimity and the creation of consensus in our public opinion. It also means, in order to be able to do this effectively, to be able to face our own fears. You said you might understand why this is sensitive. We can understand, but still, this is not a good reason not to face the contradictions of our selfishness, because we are discussing and fighting about welcoming a couple of hundreds from member state, even 1,000 refugees from member state, and we don't look at Lebanon or Jordan, that in much more difficult conditions are hosting 1.5 million people in their territories, which much more difficult conditions from an economic point of view, from a security point of view. So, if we are the strong, powerful, rich Europe, well, this has consequences. This is it. It's a matter of credibility. And this means also sharing solidarity and responsibility among ourselves, Europeans.
Thank you. We've got 10 minutes, just over. I want to summarize where we've got to. I want to ask two people in the audience to say one quick thing to contribute to the conversation, so we have a bit more participation. I'm then going to ask each member of the panel in 30 seconds to say one final message they want to take away. What is our big takeaway? And then I'm going to have a quick vote to see whether you still agree with the propositions that we started with. We've made a really strong case for the need for collective action. The President of the General Assembly has made an unanswerable case for better multilateralism. We've looked, though, at some of the issues around collective action and multilateralism, different interests, different perspectives. We've talked about the need for leadership in order to create a consensus, to have the right structure of benefits and incentives for everybody. Sometimes it's about the message, but sometimes it's about helping the losers, compensation, finding new measures that will help us to drive through. And now we have to take that message out and make a difference in the world. So, quickly, is there anybody in the audience who would like, literally you have 60 seconds to stand up, say who you are, and say something interesting, and then sit down again.
Good afternoon, good evening, my name is Marina Sierra, I'm a future leader. Federica, you've spoken a lot about moving from a Eurocentric worldview to a multipolar world, but you haven't really mentioned moving away from a state-centric worldview and taking into account the different partnerships we need to build across different stakeholders, and that how it might influence changing the processes and institutions that we talk about.
Okay, and the answer is therefore something different?
Change.
Change of what? Away from state-centred towards...
Yes, change away from state-centric, including more stakeholders in agenda setting, in decision-making processes throughout.
Okay, very good, thank you. One other person, anybody? Yes, behind, just pass the microphone back.
My name is Ramzan Shmilov. My occupation is migrant integration. I think it's very good what you have this position about what it should be more generous, etc. But there is also the part of responsibility of migrant. And it's up to us, to army of our social assistants. Now there is an internet encouraging the migrant to learn local European languages more actively. Because the person who knows the language is another person, it's more, he can act much more actively. And this is a very simple phrase. For example, for refugees from Syria, just type to Google Ta'alama al-Faransiya or al-Niderlandiya, etc. and they can already, without waiting a passport, they can begin to learn language from first day. And then acquiring all useful knowledge here in Europe, try to transfer this knowledge to their country of origin for development. Because only development agency, they can't improve the situation critically, but if the people, migrants by million, they will send this knowledge back in their country, it can improve the situation globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I have the microphone back? Of course, in England, we believe that if you just speak more loudly in English, everybody will understand. That's usually what we do. I'm going to go along the panel and really ask you to be very disciplined and start at this end. Your main takeaway and your main message to the world from this meeting, and you have 30 seconds each, so please be really disciplined, we'll start with you. Start here. Yeah, passing the microphone, sorry.
It's time for a change. We create our habits, next the habits shape us.
Okay, that was very good. Thank you very much. Leah.
Yeah, I'm thinking we should invest in energy by investing in people, especially youth, and working together globally.
Thank you very much.
Yo pienso que parte de la solución está si trabajamos en alianza público-privada-academia, donde la academia se encargue de la sensibilización y capacitación, el sector privado se encargue de toda la parte del financiamiento y el gobierno se encargue de cumplir con los normativos para resolver todos estos problemas que son grandes problemas que tenemos y encontrar una solución a largo plazo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Eu acredito que a juventude ela deve estar envolvida e participando ativamente dos processos de tomada de decisões, e também esses espaços precisam ser divulgados e precisam ser fortalecidos para que possamos realmente ter mudanças significativas na nossa realidade. Obrigado.
The first four leaders have been so quick, you can have not 30 seconds, you can have 90 seconds, or even 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, I think that collective action is the way forward, whether we are dealing with economic development, whether we are dealing with peace and security, or whether we are dealing particularly with climate change. And I think that peace and security, the situations that the world faces today, the growing terrorism, the growing extremism, all these we can only surmount if we work together. So I believe that we need to build bridges, to build consensus, and to ensure that we move this world forward together. Alone, nobody can do it, not even the most powerful nation.
Thank you very much.
I would like the 30 seconds. What I get from here. First, the need to build strong, confident persons and communities, because this allows us to take difficult decisions. This requires active participation, citizens' participation, starting from the youngest generation. I believe that the youth participation is the best school we can have for a better world in the future. Let's start it today. Second, building strong partnerships, because you refer to multipolarism. We need the poles to have a multipolar world. And we need to start thinking that having strong partners is not weakening us, but is making us strong. So that's the two things I take out of this.
Thank you very much. Beautiful.
Travaillons ensemble pour que la migration ne soit plus sélective. Travaillons pour que la migration soit un droit pour tous, pour les riches comme pour les pauvres, pour les Asiatiques comme pour les Américains, pour les Européens comme pour les Africains.
Can I have more?
No.
Just quickly, on ne peut pas avoir en fait un consensus dans les organismes régionaux qu'on a parce qu'on n'aspire pas à avoir, comme l'Union européenne, une institution régionale aussi développée. Vous avez commencé par l'économie, vous êtes passé à l'Union monétaire, après vous êtes parti vers l'Union politique avec un Parlement qui vous unit tous. Nous, on n'en est pas vraiment encore là, donc on ne veut pas aspirer à un consensus, on est encore vraiment à la base. Donc c'est pour répondre à la question. Pour la migration, je dirais que vu que l'Union européenne a une politique de voisinage et que pour le Maroc par exemple elle a le statut avancé qui a été signé il y a quelques années, je dirais que ce qui serait bien c'est de voir la stabilité dans ces pays voisins, ces pays de transit, parce que c'est de là que viennent les réfugiés et viennent actuellement les immigrants vers vos pays à l'Union européenne. Donc pour vous c'est un plus que vous ayez pour consolider un peu ces pays-là voisins pour qu'ils puissent combattre ou bien intégrer les immigrants comme fait le Maroc actuellement parce qu'il a dernièrement été félicité par l'Union européenne. Et pour finir, pour conclure, on veut donc des partenariats durables, on veut un consensus altruiste lorsqu'il s'agit d'aide et de coopération internationale et on veut des institutions qui soient démocratiques. L'Union européenne et les Nations unies, je dirais encore une fois le Conseil de sécurité, je ne lâche pas encore l'affaire. Merci beaucoup.
What I do, which is when you want to say 2 minutes and 30 seconds, you just say faster. Very good. Elizabeth.
Catherine.
Oh, sorry, Catherine. I'm sorry.
I think Africa has largely managed poverty, but we need to get to an era where we partner to increase our capacity to be able to realize economic prosperity.
Thank you. And Shakira.
I think financing the SDGs will be extremely key. Aid is still very important. I wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for aid. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for aid. But I do feel that, like Mr. Kutesa said, people are extremely important. We need to fight corruption. We need to unite and stop civil wars and stop poverty and really use these extra resources to fund the SDGs and work towards inclusive development.
Very good. We're going to end with a piece to pick up where we have been, with a piece of collective consensus building. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and you don't have to vote yes, you might want to vote no, but we will see how much we have to do. First of all, put your hands up if you agree with Mrs. Mogherini's core proposition that the problems that we face in the world are interconnected. Put your hands up if you agree with that proposition. Put your hands up if you disagree. You see how easy it is to build consensus. Put your hand up if you believe with Mr. Kutesa that multilateralism and collective action at regional and international level is the only solution to these collective action problems. Put your hand up if you agree. Put your hand up if you disagree. One or two, but not many. Third question. Do you think multilateralism faces really difficult problems? I wanted to say, is multilateralism broken? I think that's too strong. But do we face really big problems in building the kind of multilateralism that we want? Put your hand up if you agree. Put your hand up if you think everything's fine. That is the challenge that comes for me out of this meeting. The essential need for multilateralism, but the difficulty of building it, because the consensus that our leaders have talked about actually does not always exist and needs to be built. And building it needs a combination of leadership and of incentives and instruments to do it. Let me ask you one final question. Do you feel confident that with future leaders like the ones we have on the platform, the future of our planet and our society is hopeful? Put up your hand if you agree with that. Put up your hand if you disagree. We have unanimity, that's very good. In a moment I'm going to ask you to thank the panel, I'm going to thank you, but just to say that it's been agreed that there will be a photograph for young people with Mr. Kutesa and Mrs. Mogherini on this platform as soon as you have finished. What? No, that's the question. What is the age? Personally, I think anybody, I'm 67, so anybody under the age of 66 and a half is probably young. I think you should probably decide. What's the maximum age of future leaders? Is it 30, 35, 26? Anybody under 30 or 35 who wants to come and have their photograph taken can come. You've been fantastic participants. Thank you all very much.
Same place. No. Different time. Different
Leverage it out.
Like for 5 people for Millennium? So you can be some.
Ciao.